All right, so the relationship between China and Kenya, as well as Africa as a continent, has been making headlines since that infrastructure summit that is happening in China. And at this moment, we ask you on our Twitter poll question. At this point, we ask you on our Twitter poll question, do you believe China's intentions in Africa are purely to develop the continent? Do you believe China's intentions in Africa are purely to develop the continent? Tweet us at KTN News, at Akisa Wandera. We'd love to hear what you think about the China-Africa relations, the Chinese intention, what this means for Africa. I'll be sampling a number of your views just after you take on that poll before the end of the bulletin. All right, let's now take a look at just what this Silk Road project is. This renewed $124 billion renewed Silk Road project. What does it entail? So what is the Silk Road first? It is a state-owned investment fund of the Chinese government to foster increased investment in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Remember, about 2,000 years ago, our ancestors started trekking out from Asia, Europe to Africa, gave birth to the Silk Road Fund. So this would be the modern-day Silk Road project. And the Belt and Road Initiative is rooted in ancient Silk Road, just what I've explained. China is expected to fund about 15 trillion shillings for the world's most ambitious infrastructure project. It has been quipped as the world's most ambitious infrastructure project so far, including a number of countries. The number comes up to almost 100 countries that are involved in this particular project. 40 countries so far have signed that agreement. So the project was first proposed in 2013 by President Xi Jinping, and over 100 countries and international organizations have supported and got involved in this initiative. That makes it about almost 5 years now since this particular project was initiated, and China has signed cooperation agreements with over 40 countries. Remember, Kenya is one of them. Ethiopia is one of them, among other African countries. Let's take a look at some of the completed projects so far since the project was initiated in 2013. We have the hydroelectric power project in Pakistan, the liquefied natural gas project in Russia, the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. We have the China-Laos railway, the Addis Ababa-Djibouti railway, and the Hungary-Serbia railway. We have our own SGR that is not complete, but these are just some of the completed projects under the project that was initiated in 2013 by the Prime Minister of China. Now, Kenya is set to receive 19.2 billion shillings in grant from the Silk Road Fund to expand our infrastructure, among other things, but mainly this would be on infrastructure. We might have seen a number of our infrastructures being spearheaded by the Chinese. But let's now get into that discussion. What exactly does this mean for us as a country? What exactly does this mean for us as a continent? My guests in studio are already ready to help us delve into this issue and dissect it. Very good morning to you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for us. We have Felix Okach, who is a multilateral trade expert, as well as Eddie Orinda, who is a commercial law expert. Once again, always a pleasure to have you here on Worldview.
Thank you very much.
All right. I think I'll just start with posing the question we're asking our viewers this morning. Do you believe China's intentions in Africa are purely to develop this continent?
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's to develop themselves, not develop Africa. But in the course of developing Africa, they are benefiting. But start with the fact that this Silk Belt region, it's the past, they used to trade. I think way back in 1887, whatever it is, the trade from China to Mediterranean area. So the Chinese were good in selling silk, and that was their market. And over time, they moved, making roads all around. And now they want to make it a global project.
Like they already are.
They are, yeah. That's from China, you move to Mongolia, even Russia, come back to Europe, get to the Mediterranean, cross Africa, South China Sea, Pacific, and up to their place. So they're using it for globalize, how to enter a global market. And I think they've succeeded. Yeah.
So do you believe in their intentions for Africa? Is it a win-win situation?
I think it's a win-win situation in the sense that we don't have the roads,
yes,
we don't have the bridges. They're giving us, the loans to the roads. Or come home, the railway line you've seen from Mombasa to Nairobi, now it's costing 500 shillings to go to Mombasa. That's a change. You've seen Thika Road, you've seen Eastern Bypass, Southern Bypass, and the Eastlands Hotel, and also Power Project in Garissa. I think it's a change. Yeah.
Eddie, do you agree with Felix on that?
Thank you, Akisha. I think I'd like to take a completely different view from Mr. Okach. If you recall, China's interest in Africa began way back in 2006 with a policy paper which they basically came up with to position themselves in terms of how they can trade with the rest of the world in a rapidly globalizing world. And some of the strategic things that China indicated in that policy paper in 2006, which later was a culmination of the Beijing conference to discuss China-Africa trade relations, was among other things preferential credit, foreign direct investment, grants and debt cancellation, among other non-commercial areas like health and education, in which they've invested quite a bit. But I think the question I'd like to pose is whether indeed it is a win-win situation.
Like Felix puts it.
Particularly considering that we've not had a very clear audit of what our China-Africa relations is, particularly Kenya and China. It may be very impressive that there's access to easy money, and perhaps that's the reason why we are very rapidly moving away from the traditional partners like America, Germany, and Western Europe in general. But to what extent do we subject the Kenya or Africa-China relations to an economic and social audit, and even ask ourselves whether, in anticipation of the policy paper they came up with, we also have a legal instrument that then protects our economies? Because if we are not careful, the whole idea of the Silk Road project is to strategically place China in a rapidly globalizing world so they can have easier access to Europe and they can have easier access into Africa through the Horn of Africa. We're already witnessing a lot of these projects going on in Djibouti, Ethiopia, and most recently in Kenya. But is it also sensitive to our social issues? Is it sensitive to the environmental issues? Is it sensitive to governance issues, for instance?
So what are we saying? The rules of engagement are a bit vague here?
I think there's a lot of information that the Kenyan public and the African region as a whole does not have the benefit of. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves is what the cost of doing business with China in the long run is. What's the return on investment for us in the long term? We may begin to increasingly witness difficulties with the COMESA and East African community, for instance, Kenya being a member and a number of other countries that are being now gradually anchored into this project, because these two regional blocks to which we are a member have a more or less coherent international trade policy. We have a common position on tariffs, for instance. But once we are not keen on how all this fits within the Silk Road the project, I think we might be dealing with a lot more than we can anticipate. So if I have to choose, unlike Mr. Okach, between infrastructure and governance, I would rather go for governance, because in the long run, it means we have a more sustainable approach to development. It means we have a better safety net for our own local industries. It means we can determine to what extent then we engage, so that indeed it's a win-win situation. Because if it was, for instance, the SGR wouldn't have passed through the national park. But I'm not sure the Chinese care a lot about environmental issues. By now, considering the information we have about corruption in government, for instance, corruption in government, for instance, you witness the United States of America withdrawing just the other day more than $5 billion in support to the Ministry of Health. In how many instances do we hear the Chinese subject the Kenyan government to use of the increased investment that they direct towards Kenya and Africa through the so-called Silk Project? So I think what we have to understand is that this is a strategic economic engagement for the Chinese. But we must begin to ask ourselves, how then it becomes a win-win for us as well.
Felix looks like he has a lot to say to you. Yes, Felix.
You see the Chinese project, this Silk Belt region, it's like forward thinking. The way they thought over time and did the Great Wall of China. You know, the Great Wall of China is a wall like from Mombasa to Lagos. It's 2,600 miles, big and wide. So it was done over time, and they did. So now the intention is to make sure that we see the world through a project. Silk, call it Silk because you sell silk. So that's the project. It will go beyond the leader who is there, Xi Jinping. It will go beyond him. So that's the thinking of China, to dominate the world. And they've shown it by that conference, where the conference they had, which everybody in the world was there, except India, because India was not happy when they made a road through Pakistan. Yeah, there you are. But otherwise, it's a move. It's a strategic move in the long direction. Now, coming to the issues of governance. Say, Akisa, you are going for a loan in a bank. Another bank has got very stringent conditions. And now the conditions are not very stringent, but all at the end of it, it's a loan. You'd rather take the one with the less stringent conditions, you get your money, you do your project, and carry on. I agree, the way they are coming, conditions are rather, well, you can question them, but at least you can see the road, you can see the railway, you'd see certain projects. In fact, in much of Africa, even DRC Congo, the roads in DRC Congo, the mines in Lusaka, I think it was Zambia recently, Lusaka, most of them are Chinese. What we need to do is that make sure that as they come, we also negotiate what we need.
Are you satisfied that we are negotiating on what really we want for ourselves as a continent and as a country?
Let me be practical and look at only one project, the railway. And thank God I went to Mombasa recently by road, just to see the railway. You know, I've got lacking for the railway. If you look at the stations from Emali, Savo, Kibwezi, Mazera, Sapmitini, beautiful station, good work done. That's one. Two, people along the area, some of the shops are better off, people have built better houses, which means this was a spillover effect in the construction of the railway. They got the money and it changed their lives. That's one. Two, end of this month, from Mombasa to Nairobi, it will be only 500 shillings. By bus, about 1,000. 500 shillings in 5 hours. The bus takes 1,000 in 8 hours. It's a change. I agree, issues will be there in the long run. A few things have not been done right, but it's better to engage. And what China have done, the whole world is going that direction. It's a way that they started the Great Wall of China, the philosophy, the philosophy, and they're moving ahead. U.S. has forgotten the philosophy. Now you see Donald Trump, issue of things being leaked to Russia. They are not concerned about their neighbors, Mexico. They're not seeing the world in that perspective. Europe used to see the world in a better way. Like when they had the EPA, Cotonou Agreement. No, that was concerning Africa. They saw Africa as their neighbors. But over time now, Africa is not the European countries are not responding to the stringent conditions. African countries are not responding to the stringent conditions which the Europeans have put them in. But they find China easier. All we need to do is make sure that we do it to our advantage. Even in trade, I think this morning when I was coming, I looked at an economic survey, which came in about 2 weeks ago. Our trade with China, exports from China to Kenya is 330 billion. Imports from China, 330 billion. From US, 47 billion. Britain, 33 billion. It means that things are now moving in that direction. What we need to do, Wakili, is that we should take advantage of this engagement and benefit. That's what I see it.
Do you think we're taking advantage of this engagement and benefiting?
I do not think we're taking advantage enough, and perhaps that's a very, very deliberate arrangement. And I do not disagree, absolutely, and I don't want to be misunderstood on this, that loans and grants in themselves are bad. But how do we apply these loans for the general economic development of the country, and to what extent are the Chinese keen on how they are put to use? I think that's a more fundamental question. But we also have to think about where the place of the multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank are. You can, in fact, imagine a situation in which perhaps if the World Bank is financing a project of this kind, that there will be a very rigorous audit process in terms of, first and foremost, how this is going to be paid back, because if you care about how it's going to be paid back, you must care about how it's going to be put to use. So that means we don't have a lot of information. You would anticipate a process in which environmental audits are done, governance audits are done, to confirm whether or not we have, for instance, legislation or trade agreements that would support the intention of this kind of massive investment. And in fact, even more importantly, the cost of these loans on the Kenyan public. Eventually, we have to pay back these loans.
Yes.
So it may seem rather attractive and easier. It may seem like a better thing to partner in, away from the traditional partners. But we have to remember that at the end of the day, the less information we have in terms of how much money we are borrowing and how these loans are structured, the more difficult our economic conditions are going to be. So I still think that until there's openness in the dealings between Africa and China, to the extent of how Africa benefits, we are only going to get into a lot more difficulties.
Well, when you talk about the kind of debt we are in, as it stands now, Kenya owes, as far as our external debt is concerned, more than half of it is to China. But are these projects viable? Is it worth it vis-a-vis the amount of debt we are in and the kind of economic situation we would be in the next few years?
I think it is not worth it unless we get back to this audit and answer the kind of questions that I've raised. Because if you recall, for instance, the Kibaki government had a lot more emphasis on economic development that was anchored on better and more efficient ways of tax collection. And we saw tremendous progress. And we borrowed a lot less than we are borrowing now. So my thinking is, if we're borrowing a lot more now than we did, for instance, during the Kibaki regime, we should have been a lot better. But if you look at our social welfare, for instance, it's only getting worse. You have more poor people, but you have a lot of seemingly better roads. So I think for the ordinary person, this has to translate into a genuine economic empowerment that then
sounds
would
like
have a lot more.
modern day colonization to me. Is it, Alex?
But ordinarily, for any person to develop, you go to borrow. To buy a house, you borrow. To buy a car, you borrow. You cannot say, I'll save until I
But
get
just
enough
how
money.
much do you borrow?
Now, it depends on the person lending you. If the IMF loaning system takes longer, and their stringent conditions are quite stringent, you'd rather go where it's cheaper and do the road faster and start repaying the loan. But ordinarily, you have to borrow, you not develop. I've given an example of just the railway, even the southern bypass and northern bypass. As time goes, you've seen the change. We are going to pay, but at least there's a railway, there's the road, and the other power projects which are happening. Had we been waiting for EEC to fund or IMF to fund, it would have taken long. The conditions, tendering, it would take millions of years to reach where we are. But admittedly, Chinese are also doing it the wrong way because it's them who are doing the jobs. They're creating jobs for the people. Us, we just get to the periphery. So it's important to borrow. But another thing mentioned about the environment. Thank God an opportunity for me to talk about it because I've heard people talk and say that, it should not pass through the national park, things like that. But now, from Mombasa, it is passing through Savo. Isn't it? That's a park, isn't it? It comes to Athi River, Konza, that's a park. Only when it gets to Nairobi is when there's more politics. Wow. And then in Nairobi, the train is passing up higher, actually about 10 minutes high, so that the elephants can walk down and people can see the animals as it passes by. So it's free tourism for our people. It's a change. I'd rather have the railway also. It's better to have the railway than the elephant. Not that the elephant is killing people. In Voi, elephants making children don't go to school. It's mismanagement. But at least I need the road, and the elephants, of course, they've got their side. So,
Akisha, that is exactly my point, that none of these environmental issues make a lot of meaning to the Chinese government because, in fact, they have very little sensitivity to how those very natural resources contribute to our economy. And the more we destroy that, the more we become dependent on a strategic economic plan of an increasingly growing economy that at whose mercy we'll have to be at some point. And I think what the public needs to take a lot more interest on is to hold the government accountable, because it may be argued that government-to-government procurement is more convenient, as Okach said, because it's easier, where parties do not care so much about the details regarding the actual development for us. In fact, not for the Chinese. But in the long term, we are increasing our indebtedness. Every child who's going to be born is going to owe a lot more than we do now. And these loans and engagements will cease to be useful at all. And again, I just want to take us back to reflect a little on a period of about 10 years during the Moise regime, when the traditional partners stopped funding for the Kenya government for about 10 years. And we did not rush to the east. We had to rely on our own internal resources, part of which, a large part of which was in fact tax. So a more fundamental question is, how much are we losing from our own tax collection that would otherwise go into the economy and reduce our interest in borrowing? Borrowing is not bad, but I think we are borrowing a little too much, and it's not clear what we're using this money for.
Very quickly, I understand we're running out of time, but China is America's largest trading partner. This involvements and the investments they're making, how is it going to affect the geopolitics and the status quo that have been there for a while? Quickly, I understand we don't have too much time. I'll start with you.
I think the rest of the world increasingly is getting into a very, very vulnerable position with China. If you take the US, for instance, whose example you've just given, a lot of the US industries have already been moved to China, perhaps because it's cheaper to run those industries from there. There's a lot of cheap loans also that have come from China for the US government. Eventually, there's going to have to be, if we have to have a balanced relationship, a lot less appetite for the so-called free money. And it means even a lot more for Africa. If you consider the stringent processes through which money has to be acquired from the EU, for instance, or from the multilateral organizations, we end up with a much better result and return on investment than if we did in an environment in which we are borrowing endlessly and not being very, very clear on how these funds are being useful to us.
So last word is King Napoleon. When he went to China, he said that China was too big for someone to get through. It's a sleeping giant. But now, 2017, China is a giant who has woken up. Kenya must trade with the giant. Thank you very much.
Yeah, quite a last word, that one. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in. We have Felix Okach is a multilateral trade expert, as well as Eddie Orinda, commercial law expert. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming in. And of course, we'll continue to keep an eye on the Africa-China relations as well as the Kenya-China relations. Let's take a look at what's coming up.